Recovery is a journey. Your day is not gone, or you haven't failed because you've engaged with your behavior once more. Every hour is the opportunity to do something that's recovery promoting.
Emilie Faure is the CEO and founder of Juniver, a health company positioned to transform the $66 billion market for eating disorders. Through a first-of-its-kind digital solution, Emilie left a prominent career in the art world, working for companies like Sotheby's and the British Museum to become a founder based on her own personal experience with eating disorder.
My life was on the surface, very glamorous. I was traveling, I was selling very high-end art, doing art fairs. And on the side, I was battling an eating disorder. It's the fact that people think eating disorders are the skinny girl. And I hear this from investors. I hear this from other stakeholders. I hear this in my own life. Eating disorders are not a big problem. You don't see that many skinny girls in the street. Women's health in general and eating disorders don't exclusively affect women, but they disproportionately affect them. 25% of our members are men, by the way. I think that's something to really talk about as well, is how much eating disorders affect men. The collective misread on the scale of the problem has led to less funding. Venture funding mostly goes to men, and that's by a huge amount. 97% of it goes to male founders. So I think that there's also a challenge of innovating in this space when a lot of the funding is coming from people who are less likely to have been directly affected.
You use a number of times addiction. Is there an importance with actually recognizing that an eating disorder is an addiction, and why is that important?
I think it's a word that is very triggering for me. I think
Welcome to Everyday Leadership Podcast, a podcast where we would delve behind the scenes to understand the stories of amazing leaders doing amazing things. And today, my guest is doing exactly that. I have Emilie, who is the founder and the CEO of Juniver, a company that's focused on helping people struggling with eating disorders. And they're doing that in a number of different revolutionary ways, I'm going to say, but all evidence-based. Which I look forward to kind of delving a bit more and unpacking what that is, what that's about with her. But for now, welcome, Emilie, to the podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm good.
It's always interesting when you start to look into people the non-creepy way for research purposes for the podcast, and your history and your journey is one that I find quite fascinating. So even just before we would delve into where you're right now and your company, I am curious, how do you introduce yourself to people when you meet them nowadays?
Yeah, I'm very much the founder and CEO of Juniver today. And eating disorders, which is the focus of the company, has also become part of my story in ways that it hadn't been before. And that's what we're proud of with the work that we're doing, is not just evolving how eating disorders are treated, but also the conversation around them. So I now introduce myself through the lens of Juniver and hold that history close.
How long have you been in the UK? Because it's like you've been in the UK for a while, then you're in the US, and I'm like, where are you? Like, are you actually here in the US?
Yeah, I haven't been. I'm originally French. My parents are French. I was born in Paris, lived in the US, hence this accent when I was a child. We moved around a lot. My parents were journalists, and so have lived in a number of different places, but landed in New York after college, and then came to London, and now split my time between London and New York.
Okay. Wow. That's a very rich background in terms of like traveling, I guess, cultures as well. That's quite helpful for you.
Yeah, exactly. I think with our mission and with what we do, it really crosses borders.
And I am typically on the podcast, it's very open and we just have a conversation, which we're going to do, but I'm always curious around people's journeys. So if I was to go back to a younger version of you, let's say a 9-10-year-old version of you, who was Emilie then? What were you about?
Yeah, I was very creative. I always enjoyed creating and making things. I started an art club at school, brought people on to paint and do all sorts of things, and then kept that passion through college. Went to college to study art, and in that time realized that what I particularly enjoyed was bringing people together around a shared idea and a vision. And so left college to work in the art world, but in a commercial part of it. So an agency for photographers. And we would, sign deals with advertising agencies, editorial clients, to have those photographers bring their vision to life. And it was a really exciting time. I stayed in the art world for quite some time in commercial roles, in sales, and loved that side of it, really having a team brought together around a project and delivering an outcome, and connecting people, getting the best out of them, and staying really creative. There was always a creative part of it that I particularly loved and got me really energized. And so today, it's a very different industry, but some of those key elements remain and are fundamental to the startup life.
Because even when you talk about being in the art world, you've been in sales, you've been in strategy, you've been in consultancy. So it sounds like you are what I would call, which I actually find with a lot of creators, actually, an explorative mindset and mentality of, actually, I wonder what, if I went into this space or this industry, what would happen? And then you bring some of those transferable skills from what you love into those spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very much about bringing people's sometimes differing points of view together and making something come out of it. And that continues to be what really brings me energy and inspires me is trying to come together around a goal and with creativity and in the mix, for sure.
When you were in that space, I'm actually curious, because a lot of things around people in the art world, and first thought comes to my head is that starving artist mentality. And then I know a lot of what you were doing was slightly different, but when you're in that space and you see a lot of people who are trying to bring their art to life, and it's a long, hard, arduous process, and then you move from that into the startup world, why did you decide to make that transition?
Yeah, and I think the art world, you're right. There's a very big dichotomy between that starving artist and one side of the art world, which is high-end art and items that are priced in the 6 to 7 and 8 digits. So there's certainly the opportunity for more balanced in between. But in terms of how I went from one to the other, I had an eating disorder for a really long time, just like 10% of the population. And as my career was picking up, I got progressively worse. I was seeing a therapist at the time. I had saved up to make that happen, and it wasn't ever at noon on a Wednesday when I was sitting in her office that I had a problem. It was really every moment around that. And so when I eventually recovered, and I can, speak to how that also unfolded, when I got better and recovered, felt quite strongly that we needed better solutions than the gold standard treatment, which is that once a week appointment, cognitive behavioral therapy appointment with a clinician. I felt that, eating disorders potentially were about my past, but often, they're not, they present in your life and in your brain as an addiction. It's really a compulsive condition. And so you need something when you have that compulsion. You need support at that time. And those moments are unpredictable. They often occur, at times of the day where your therapist isn't available. And so it became something I thought about very actively while working and while being, still very much engaged in the art world. And at the time I was in a large gallery and traveling a lot and seeing around me in my immediate circles, but also more broadly, a lot of people facing similar issues. And so when COVID hit, and at that point I had been, recovered for some time, started to think about a solution and what that could look like, and put together a team of clinicians and really ran a very early prototype, put that in the hands of 100 users, 100 people who had crossed my path and who we also recruited. It was a mix of those two. And we asked them if it had helped them. And it did. And we got really good results around that early pilot. And so I then, at that point, raised a little bit of money and left my full-time job and started to think about Juniver as a business and really thinking through, what's the impact that we want to have? How are we going to really move the needle in terms of efficacy? The more I dug into the research, it struck me as, first of all, very much focused on the anorexic patient. So stereotypically, a very young female underweight patient, and that's only 6% of the eating disorder population. Most eating disorders show up in bodies like yours and mine. And so they're hard to identify. They're invisible disorders. And so it struck me that research was not consistent with how eating disorders were showing up in the population. And also that the gold standard treatment, the best treatment out there, was really ineffective. It wasn't just my experience with it, but research that showed it was 30% effective only for eating disorders. And so our position, or my hypothesis, then became our product, or the foundation of our product, which is that you need support in the moment of need, which is that compulsive moment. And you also need an empowering message. I think a lot of people with eating disorders are told messages that aren't really helpful or don't make recovery seem possible. It's really hard to recover, or you might not get there. It's often misconstrued as a vanity problem. So redressing that and really taking a stance as representative of really the wide range of eating disorders, and certainly the wide range of needs. How do we improve our knowledge of eating disorders, and how do we personalize treatment for better outcomes?
Let's take a step back and what are eating disorders, and how did you actually even figure out that there was something wrong and you had an eating disorder in your journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of people ask us, I haven't been diagnosed. Is that a problem? Like we say, if you have a problematic relationship with food that you want to change, that's enough. That's enough to warrant you taking that step and for us to help you through it. So I can touch on the diagnostic criteria for eating disorders, which is a big conversation in the field, because it's, and I speak for many here, it's pretty outdated. It's very limited. It's often, your diagnosis is often tied to your body mass index. And for you to get help in the UK where you are, that it's still pegged on a low BMI, a low body mass index. So I, for example, I was living in London at the time. I couldn't access help on the NHS, the National Health Services, because I wasn't underweight enough. That's now, very much in conversation to change, but still the criteria is problematic. And then it takes also a person some time to admit to themselves that they might have a problematic relationship with food. It starts often with a diet. You restrict and you start to have urges because your body's needs kicks in, right? You have to consume to survive. And so your body's designed to want food if you undereat. And so we've really, through practicing those behaviors, they get more and more ingrained. So you restrict, and then you have urges that feel very overwhelming, and you start compulsively overeating. That's a very typical cycle of restriction and overeating. Some people compensate for that overeating behavior and then restrict again, and then you're back in that cycle. So that describes an eating disorder called binge eating disorder. Bulimia, if you compensate for that afterwards, essentially that's the majority of eating disorders, binge eating disorder and bulimia. Anorexia is restriction. There's atypical anorexia, which is a variation on that. And then ARFID, which is a restrictive eating disorder as well, with a different presentation. But broadly speaking, I invite people to really look at what they want to change in their life. It doesn't matter to reach out and request support. It doesn't matter whether you have you meet the criteria. What matters is it interfering with your life? It's really a condition that becomes an obsession, and it's important to start thinking about how to free yourself from those thoughts, from those behaviors, so that you can make room for other things that you want in your life.
Did you have any warning signs in your life, or there people around you who noticed that there was something wrong when you were going through it?
Yeah, I when I lost weight pretty dramatically at one point, people commented on that. I think people with eating disorders are really good at keeping them hidden. And so when I started talking about my history, it surprised many, even though it had been a part of my daily life for many years.
I think that's I've had a number of conversations with people in regards to eating disorders, and that's one of the biggest things. It's like there is a internal dialogue, there's an internal shame that you have, and then they talk about that's internal, but externally they are good at hiding it. So whether it's the clothes that they wear, the things that they're around, or people who are older and living by themselves, so they don't have people in their lives who can see what's going on for them, they can easily mask it. And it's when it really starts to affect them from a health perspective, it's when it's like, okay, I can no longer hide this anymore. And then they cry out for help. So I'm most curious, like with you being able to recognize there was something wrong and seek help, how did you go through feelings of that shame and things like people described to me? And if so, how did you kind of get over that to get to the point where I need to do something about this before it got really, really bad?
Yeah, I think it also, a distinctive characteristic of eating disorders is that they ebb and flow. So you go through periods where you feel like you have it under control, and then you go back to, behaviors that are very problematic and interfere with your functioning. So that becomes exhausting in itself, to have to not be able to trust yourself. Self-trust is a big part of what we help people rebuild, is moving away from that shame and that stigma that is so strong because of plenty of things we can talk about in terms of the society we live in. But you also deal with just an internal dichotomy between the person that you are and your values and how you're showing up for yourself. And that becomes that erodes your self-worth after a while. You start not trusting yourself, and you start feeling like a fraud. And so it's important to say that that's not your fault. It's really a condition that you've practiced long enough for it to become this behavior in your life, but you can undo that. And the amazing thing is how rewarding the other side of that is when you do rebuild healthier habits to replace those that you were engaging in. The amount of space that's created in your life, in your brain, in your friendships, in your love life, it's incredibly expansive, the life that lies on the other side. And that's hard to imagine when you have an eating disorder. And that's, if anyone who has an eating disorder is listening today, that's, I hope, what they will leave with. It's really this sense that it is better. And there's a mistrust of that. You don't know, there's a certain satisfaction that comes with being in a behavior that's so familiar that has in some cases kept you safe, right? Eating disorders can come out of trauma. It can come out of plenty of really difficult circumstances. And so it does become a protective behavior that you've built in that context. And to start paving the way for a different life, a different way to feel, new emotional fluency, a different strength. It's something that I think stays too abstract for people. And you think, just one more time, or the phrases that come up for any type of addiction, and by extension for eating disorders, it's those phrases in your mind that tell you to lean into your behavior in the moment, and a day goes by and it's another day that you're still struggling. So I think having this real focus on a day without it is better, and they're going to grow, and your life step by step is going to expand and become so much more than what you could have expected. It's very hard to imagine an expansive life when you're caught in the throes of an eating disorder. It's hard to visualize, but I want everyone who's listening to really trust that it's worth it.
How do you go from where you are right now to begin to make that journey into that life that you've just described, that there is hope on the other side, there's a whole different life on the other side, and it's hard to be able to picture or feel that right now? How did you, or what helped you begin to make that change and actually believe that and then step forward to do that? Because like you said, when you're in it, you can't see that, you can't feel that. It's a whole different world. It just sounds way out there, and that's a fairy tale. So how did you begin to make those moves personally when you did that?
There's some very tactical things that feel small, but that have a big impact. And one of those things for me was having a group of people who were not in my life. My life was on the surface, very glamorous. I was traveling, I was selling, very high-end art, and, doing art fairs. And on the side, I was battling an eating disorder. And I had a group of people that were similar to me, engaged in jobs that were demanding and that were shiny. And we created a group, and we texted one another when we felt triggered, when it was a challenging moment, when we just wanted to give up. And that community, that mini group of people that I initially contacted in those moments, became a bit of, A, gave me comfort that I wasn't alone, and two, were able to walk me out of these moments where you could tip into, your behavior or into a healthier habit that you start to build. And so that's one way, and it's not available to everyone. And that's what we've created with Juniver, a community. We have a free program on the app. There's a freemium and then a premium program. The freemium gives you access to that community because we feel like it's the most essential part of recovery. And the other piece to it is that bigger vision. And you can do that in, again, very small ways. For example, by having a mantra or an affirmation that you'll repeat in the moment that you feel the most triggered. And it's something about your true worth, or something that resonates with you particularly. So having a set of affirmations, also something we've built in Juniver, where you have a mantra that you'll say out loud or to yourself in a moment that's tricky. And the other thing to remember in those moments is that an urge, regardless of what it's for, will last on average 15 minutes. And after that moment, it dissipates, it becomes less intense. But when you're in the peak of those 15 minutes, it can feel absolutely impossible to overcome it. But knowing that it lasts for that short period of time helps you sit through it. And you can do something. We encourage people to get out, walk around your block, or if you can't do that, step into a different room or put what you're holding down. And it's these small things that then start to build into habitual things. And so those are some of the strategies that I've certainly used in my own life, and that we know that our members today are finding valuable. There's another important part of it is to distinguish that voice of your eating disorder. Again, this is consistent with any addiction. And I know that some will not identify with the word addiction. So I invite you to not let that block you. But essentially that sense of two voices battling each other in your mind. You have the voice of your eating disorder that says to pursue, for whatever reason, what you're about to do. And then the voice of your executive brain, so to speak, that in those moments goes offline, but can be revived if you bring it back to mind. And so we have tools in Juniver to really literally do that for you. You'll see what's called a cognitive distortion. So a misunderstanding of the truth in that moment through a thought. And then you see, essentially you're talked out of it by seeing a reflection of more accurate picture. And so those types of things are helpful. And that sense of resilience, of confidence will grow. In the beginning, it's going to feel hard. In the beginning, you might quote unquote slip. That word is not ideal, but you'll, revert back to behaviors that you want to erode or erase from your life. And instead, it's about reaffirming that, recovery is a journey. It's every day, it's not a whole, your day is not gone, or you haven't failed because you've engaged with your behavior once more. It's, every hour is the opportunity to do something that's recovery promoting. So using also this, avoiding the black and white mindset of thinking good or bad, what am I, good or bad? It's, very diet culture-y and not helpful in the context of recovery. So moving towards a different mindset around the opportunity to rebuild your life in these micro moments is important.
It sounds very much like the rewiring of the synapses that need to happen in your brain to start to think differently. It's having that sense of community and some of the things that you talked about. It's rewriting that neuron over and over and over again until it becomes the new one that then takes over as opposed to the previous ones that were there. But then you need to have the right community and people around you to help reinforcing that, as well as all the different mantras and stuff that you talked about as well. If not, you can easily slip backwards, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's true that, the patterns in your brain that you're rewiring, it will soon become effortless. And that's also something that doesn't feel tangible when you're in it. This, challenge of urges that keep showing up. It's important to remember that that's not a fight you're going to have to fight for much longer if you keep overcoming urges when they show up. And the other thing we haven't spoken about, but that's important to remember, is a lot of people with eating disorders restrict, and that's what's holding them back in part. So having, the ability to plan your meals and your snacks, 3 meals, 2 snacks, you're eating regularly, you want to stabilize your blood sugars, that's really important. If you're still restricting, your urges are going to be harder to overcome.
Well, I'm curious to hear your opinion on, do you think social media plays a role in the development or reinforcement of eating disorders?
Yes, I think that's not a controversial opinion to have anymore. I think it's very much built into algorithms to draw us into what we watch and what we look at, and people with eating disorders will tend to gravitate towards content that can sometimes be very, very challenging to look at when you're trying to recover from something like an eating disorder. So it's also important to build healthy habits around that, to clean up your feed. Don't go down rabbit holes with content that you can't control. So we're not prescriptive about what that looks like, but it's certainly important to make sure you're surrounding yourself with positive influences.
The reason I asked you that was, then there's another, because previously it used to be exactly that. It's like, it's not healthy, it's not great, you need to curate your feed. And then there's another school of thought recently where it's like, yeah, but then there are accounts on, I don't know, IG, TikTok, whatever, that are created and dedicated that shine a light on ways of coping, and people can build communities on there. But it's like, yeah, but because of an algorithm, it will feed you some good stuff and some bad stuff. So how do you strike the balance, if possible? Whereas when there's some people who's like, nope, just don't look at it, social media at all, and other people that actually could help you build. So with your work and you navigating things around community behavior and things like that, I'm always very curious to see how do you view it? How do you advise people in your community to be able to navigate, especially depending on age as well, the things that it's easy to get access to social media platforms and they feel a lot more comfortable than going into some other forums that might exist as well.
Mm-hmm. I think it is about curating. So seeing what that content does to your thoughts and to your actions. If you look at content that's about what I eat in a day, which is very common content on Instagram and TikTok, what I eat in a day is not helpful to view if you have an eating disorder, because you're trying to rebuild hunger and fullness signals. You're trying to retrust your body to tell you what it needs, and watching someone else eating and what they have in a day is going to fuel thoughts of self-doubt. So but this takes a certain maturity. So it's, not necessarily easy for a 15-year-old girl to do this, but having the ability to really notice the impact of some types of content that may on the surface be, healthy eating is important, is to start again with, that gentle curiosity of what's happening inside me right now, trying to identify, actually, I don't need that anymore. That's not serving me. That's not promoting my recovery. It's making my food noise, this expression describing the amount of thinking dedicated to food or your body is increasing. We have that in the app. You can measure the level of food noise. A lot of people with eating disorders will use that as a qualifier of whether it's been a good day for their recovery. Again, good and bad is not the descriptors we would encourage, but essentially, it's about how much of my thinking is dedicated to food. And if it's high in a certain day, they feel like they're going back. So moving towards less thinking about food and more space for other things is what recovery is partly about. And content on Instagram is often linked to an increase in food noise.
You have been very intentional when you described Juniver right at the start. You talked about how the help and the care wasn't adequate when you experienced it, and you got evidence around that. I looked at the research, and in the UK, for example, I think they say roughly costs about 10 billion a year when it comes to eating disorders. In the US, it's around 6 to 5 billion. But then if you take into account well-being and all the impacts, it can go up to 400 billion. These are massive numbers. So why is it that if it's costing governments that much money, the help, the advice, I guess even the investment that's going into an area such as this hasn't really changed that much, and the help isn't great? Hence why you had your organization's been created.
I think it's a combination of a few things. One is women's health in general, and eating disorders don't exclusively affect women, but they disproportionately affect them. 25% of our members are men, by the way. I think that's something to really talk about as well, is how much eating disorders affect men. And they face extra shame and stigma, which shrinks statistics. And so we end up thinking, no, men don't have that problem. They absolutely do, and they need help just like anyone else. We have we're in a situation in the U.S. and certainly in the UK where women having been excluded from clinical research since '93 in the U.S. So you're looking at a lot of gender health inequity because of a gender health gap. Women being excluded because
from research.
Clinical research didn't include women until '93 because hormonal changes, menstruation, pregnancy made it harder to collect data on those populations. And so for ease of research purposes, the clinical research that was happening until '93 was largely on male bodies, which now means a lot of medication is not adapted to female bodies and not suited for the way our body metabolizes drugs. But putting that aside for a moment, we're with eating disorders in a situation where there's been limited research, and because of the shame and stigma, there's a misunderstanding around how many people are affected. People do not speak up until much later in the course, and often once they've recovered. So they've struggled in silence, often on average for 10 years. And we also understand eating disorders as being that very underweight female patient. And that is a big part of the problem, but only 6% statistically of eating disorders across the population. So I think part of our mission at Juniver is to better represent eating disorders for what they are, which is a problem that affects anyone across all demographics, all genders. We have a lot of menopausal women on the platform. That's also a stigmatized group when it comes to eating disorders. Pregnant women, hormonal changes will revive or trigger an eating disorder. So we have a lot of those groups too on Juniver's platform. The collective misread on the scale of the problem has led to less funding. We know that venture funding is mostly goes to men, and that's by a huge amount. It's 97% of it goes to male founders over female founders. So I think that there's also that challenge of innovating in this space when, a lot of the funding is coming from people who are less likely to have been directly affected. As we've discussed, it affects men 25%. So it's not a majority. And we know that with the funding landscape, a lot of the people that we're talking to haven't had an experience of eating disorders directly.
Do you treat, in fact, how have you been able to encourage men to get involved with Juniver and share? Because like you said, there's a massive amount of stigma that's associated with men in particular stepping up, and to have 25%, it's massive. So how have you been able to do that? And then are the treatments similar, or do you treat men and women very, very differently?
On Juniver, it's a self-guided program. We're building a virtual clinic, JuniCare. For now, it's through the app. And so you have personalization through a chat functionality that we've trained to deliver the advice of an eating disorder therapist. So you open the app and you see Junie, and Junie's been trained to give that clinical grade advice and to be personalized to your needs. So it maintains rigor in terms of the advice it gives. It's not going to, for example, reduce your meal plan. If you ask it for a meal plan and say you're not comfortable eating that amount, it's going to push back on that and say, wait, this is actually what you need to eat to function optimally today. Can we help you break it down so it feels more manageable? So it's trained to deliver that. And then it's also trained to, with use, learn what you like. So if you don't like meditation, it's not going to recommend that as a way to overcome or dismiss an urge. Junie is therefore adapts to the male members on the platform, to the female members on the platform. Broadly speaking, because it's a behavioral health condition, the problems people are coming with, regardless of their age and background, tend to be help me overcome this urge that I'm facing right now. And so those strategies are going to be adapted to what you find helpful, what you find valuable, but they typically have to do with how do you build that resilience in the moment, and how do you structure your meals during the day so that you're not seeing those urges continue to present.
Is Junie based on an AI that's consistently feeding itself based on the communications you're having with all your different members?
Yeah, so it's trained on our program. So we've spent 2.5 years building the curriculum in the program, and that's with a leading researcher in eating disorders who runs a lab at Mount Sinai looking at the neuroscience of eating behavior. We built this program that's where people on the platform spend the most time. So they love the module that we've built because they're empowering. They help them understand where this habit's coming from, why it feels so overwhelming to have an urge, and what to do from a practical perspective when one hits. So that curriculum has gone into training Junie, and then we've built guardrails with our clinical leadership. So those are around safety protocols. They're around what do we know people with eating disorders will ask that needs to be addressed in a certain way. So there's additional training through that. And then if you use it frequently, it learns from that, and the output will be adjusted to your preferences within the guardrails that we've set.
What are some common misconceptions that annoy you, frustrate you when you hear them, that you want to debunk and break down?
I think you've probably heard me say this a couple of times already. It's the fact that people think eating disorders are the skinny girl. And I hear this from investors. I hear this from other stakeholders. I hear this in my own life. Eating disorders are not a big problem. You don't see that many skinny girls in the street. So you still today hear things like that. And that's what I really hope that we're going to soon change, because it's, I think it's very outdated, and it's certainly erroneous.
How has your journey as a founder and a CEO been? How have you found it employing people, raising capital, leading a team, getting out there? How's that been for you?
I've loved it. It's been really phenomenal. I mean, it's hard. That's I think, a known fact. But it's been really great to get people around our mission. What's been the most, we've just recruited a very talented head of ops, and she commented on the amount of inbound we get, people writing us for an internship or a job just to volunteer and help because they've had an eating disorder they're struggling with one. And she said, she came from a larger company, also in healthcare. She said, it's really incredible to see the amount of inbound with, we don't do advertising. And so that's been really validating, is to have confirmation every day in the stories we hear, and certainly what we get into our inboxes, that it's a big need and that people are alone and they need support. And then there's the side of it that is, how to build a business that's scalable and that's going to have the most impact possible. And that's been a great journey to create a product that people want to use. We knew fundamentally that if you're going to help people overcome an urge, you better be engaging. You better be something people want to pull out when they're facing an urge, right? And so we really designed an app that's not a logging tool, that's not, the kind of form that you'd have to fill out at the doctor's office. It's not about that. It's really consumer product and helping people really feel empowered when they're triggered and challenged. So that's been the journey on the product side, on the early product side. And now we're partnering with clinicians to help support their patients, because their patients have told them, hey, I'm using this app Juniver. Do you know about it? And so we've had clinicians reach out to us a lot in the past few months saying, hey, my patients are using Juniver. Is there any, what do you do for us? And so we've built a new offering that we haven't even put on the website yet to serve clinicians and to help them deliver better care and support their patients in between appointments. Because as we know, that's, the appointment is really valuable. The work of therapy is fundamental. We know this, and I'll reiterate that was part of my journey, and it was important. But those moments in between are also when you need support. So helping clinicians deliver that support while setting healthy boundaries with their patients. We know that a lot of people will offer texting or email, but that's not always something that you can do extensively. So having the ability to say, okay, Juniver is your tool between sessions, and then I'll see you in my practice on whatever day of the week it is. And then we also know that for people with higher medical needs, there's there's need for one-on-one appointments and perhaps higher levels of care at times. And so we are building that virtual clinic to help people get more support when they need it, and then partnering with higher levels of care to get them that additional care if they do need it.
As a founder and a leader who's supposed to have the big vision, how are you dealing with ideas that you might have and then ideas that come out from the community or like the clinicians, for example, when they reached out and then be like, okay, do we have space on our roadmap? What do we do? Do I do this now? How are you actually dealing with that back and forth, especially for something that so many people want and therefore there's a lot that can be done with it. But part of, I guess, wisdom is also knowing that not everything is done all at once and you have to take your time and gradually build. So how are you dealing with that?
I think that's where lived experience is so important. I have high conviction on what we're doing, and I know what our roadmap looks like because I know what it feels like to have an eating disorder and what treatment currently the landscape looks like too. So on that front, I think it's a real strength for people in healthcare in particular to know what patients that they're serving are facing.
What would you want to see happen in this space? And what would you want Juniver to really change in the mindsets of both individuals and the healthcare system in general?
I think there's the need for so much more innovation in healthcare, but certainly in these more neglected issues in healthcare. We know that research funding has been scarce, and we know that because of clinical research having been, having left certain groups out, that a condition like an eating disorder is often misunderstood. So there's a lot more that we want to do, and we're doing clinical research. From day one, we started doing that, and we're partnering with King's College to conduct that clinical research with measures. We're measuring outcomes on the EDQ scale, which is a clinical assessment for eating disorders. And we're seeing a lot of our members opt in because I think that's what also people who have had an experience with a traditionally neglected issue are somewhat activists in this journey, right? They've seen the problems with what their doctors have said to them or with the fact they've had to wait for 9 months to get any type of help. So having that experience has made them really want better and more. And so they're contributing voluntarily to research that we're doing. So more research, definitely. And then also really innovating with technology. I think with a compulsive condition like an eating disorder, that in the moment intervention is really crucial. So we're excited about, and we know the conversation with AI, is really so rich and exciting when it comes to healthcare. I'm particularly excited about the match between the problem space we're operating in and what this technology can unlock. This really personalized voice in your pocket that walks you out of an urge. I mean, what a great fit.
When you think about things like tech and AI and where it can take you to and what it can help you with, I get curious about the human side and more importantly, the human voice. And what I mean by that is something that you mentioned earlier and we kind of stuck out to me. And I was curious, how big of a role does self-compassion play in recovery, which is the human side for me? And how big is that element of actually even going through the journey when it comes to actually stepping out of or dealing with your eating disorder?
Self-compassion is everything. And I think we, with doing something over, the definition of addiction is a version of, you keep doing something even though you don't want to. And that what that does to self-compassion is brutal. So rebuilding that is key. And also it's key to understand that it's not by beating yourself up that you're going to get better. And I think that across the board, but in particular, when you're recovering from an eating disorder, you really need to be kind to yourself because that's what's going to create room for you to feel empowered and resilient. And so it's fundamental, and it also is hard to identify in the moment. So if you have a narrative in that, that ticker tape that goes, I like to refer to it as is that, when you watch the news and you have ticker tape at the bottom of the screen, sometimes what's the ticker tape in your brain is not necessarily the one you would want to tell a friend. And so having that marker of, is this language I would use for my close friends or somebody I love? Would I be talking to them in that way? And having a little bit more objectivity towards what we're using as the language we're directing towards our own selves is a part of that growing awareness. Okay, yes, actually, I do need self-compassion, because the narrative that's been going through my mind all these years has not been kind, and that becomes a gradual moving towards understanding. Yeah, self-compassion is not an empty word or one that's overused. It's actually a real shift in how I've been addressing myself.
In regards to that, why did you call your company Juniver? I'm actually curious.
Ver is Latin for truth, and Juni is desired in Old Breton, which is a part of France. So it's the French roots and the truth. So desire truth, to really return to that truth. I think we've talked about it a bunch already, but that sense that, you're not living your truth. You're not living in your truth when you have an eating disorder, and that being really the violent part of it.
Love that. If someone is currently listening to this episode right now, they are struggling with an eating disorder, they are in that place that you described where they can't see the other side, they can't see things getting better, what is the first step you would advise them to take?
Download Juniver. And I don't mean it that, we're a freemium app, and that's really intentional to be accessible for anyone who needs it. You want a community. You want to have the opportunity to get tools when you feel like you're being triggered or challenged. So having that in your pocket can be beneficial. And then the message I will, repeat over and over again to people who are struggling is life on the other side is 1,000 times better. You're living in black and white. You're going to have a life in color. And it's that radical of a change. And it will happen gradually, but you will one day look back and think, wow, I thought my life was fine, because you're managing, people in eating disorders who are experiencing one will often be functional. Not always. I'll add plenty of caveats to that statement. Plenty of people are too unwell to operate, but many are in healthy weight bodies, quote unquote, healthy weight bodies, and or overweight bodies, regardless of the size, they are functioning and productive. And so having being told, well, it's going to be much better. You think, well, my life is fine. I'm doing fine. I'm okay. There, it's manageable. I'm managing. So the message is really, is that really all you want? No, it's not. We know that. And so taking that leap of faith of I'm going to take recovery seriously, and I'm going to do it. I know it's going to be a step-by-step process. It's going to be every small moment matters, but that's going to be what I dedicate my time to when I have these opportunities at certain junctures to engage with an eating disorder behavior or not. I'm going to make that choice to not engage. That hinges on the trust that life is so much better on the other side and worth it.
Do workplaces and organizations have any part to play in supporting their employees better when it comes to dealing with eating disorders? Or is it something that's so personal as like, actually, that doesn't need to go into that realm from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there's, in the UK, it's going to be more on the NHS, but in the US, employers are insurers. And so you really want to be supporting your employees in a way that allows them to not just be productive, but also thrive. And so we need to understand the impact eating disorders are having on people's lives to better get behind that support from all places.
There's a word you use a number of times, addiction. And it's a word when it comes up, I know people just flinch and freeze like, no, I don't have an addiction. But is there an importance with actually recognizing that an eating disorder is an addiction, and why is that important?
I think it's a word that is very triggering for many, I think plenty of people will not identify with it. And that being said, it's also an experience that's true to people with eating disorders, the experience of keeping at something that you're confounded by, you're doing something repeatedly that you don't want to do. And then it manifests in your life and in your brain like an addiction. It's something you're hiding. It's something that you're ashamed of. And it's something that manifests in urges that feel overpowering. You cannot do, it's very hard to overcome them, and you can't imagine not experiencing them. So it's consistent with some definitions of addiction. Food addiction is not a term that is a diagnostic criteria. So it's something that a lot of people will recognize as a label that describes their experience and their relationship with food. But I don't, we're just like the diagnostic criteria that we talked about earlier being narrow. These are only partially helpful. What really matters is your thinking around food and your behavior around food interfering with the life you want to lead. That's what matters, and that's what you have to return to. Is it what other people are putting on it as a label is helpful in some contexts, but it's also fundamentally a choice that you need to make about getting on this journey towards recovery.
Got two more questions as we wrap up, and I've learned so much just listening to you talk, and it's always interesting when you say that you see founders in positions or creating companies, there's a passion when they've been through it, and the knowledge and the approach they have is not the typical technical way they can get it. It's more of a felt sense, and that's what makes a difference in the way that you're approaching describing things and breaking things down. So that's an amazing thing to hear, and such a knowledgeable way to actually learn from. And the question is like, how do you're now a leader in an organization as a founder as well. So how do you define leadership?
I think it's about creating clarity and fostering resilience in a way that's going to help people do their best work. And it's not about having all the answers. It's about creating that space where they feel empowered. You're going to inspire them around a vision and work through things together. Well, empathy is part of it for us, for sure.
And like you said right at the start, you're a very creative person. Do you still dabble in the art side of things at all, or is that just a previous life that you just kind of parked for now?
I love our branding, our product design. So I've been very involved on the product side, and that's been a creative exercise. And there's so many ways that creativity can manifest or can be carved out of, especially startup life. Everything everything is just an idea until you build it, and so that exercise is really creative across the board beyond design, and that's been super satisfying. And I'll say that too for any listeners who are on that journey is I think if you join an early stage company, be ready to be creative. I think that's a really important part of what's not on the job description that will make your role much more satisfying.
It never is. You got to roll up your skis, get creative, get innovative, get into it. I'm going to ask you this anyway. I'm curious from your art background perspective. There was how do you feel about things like, I'm sure you've seen the invisible sculpture that's sold for like 20 grand, which is high-end art, but for something that doesn't exist. What's your opinion on things like that nowadays?
I think, we can have a whole other podcast on conceptual art. Ultimately, there is, value in an idea. And so, we can list the examples of surprising prices reached for artworks that are in many people's minds. Well, they're not craftsmanship. They're not, there's not a skill required in terms of the painterly gesture or the craft. It's the idea that's being put on a pedestal, so to speak. And that's, I think that there's certainly value in that. And those visionary artists have certainly changed our definition of art, moving past our attribution of value to something that's skillfully made.
Where can people find out more about Juniver, get involved, download the app, reach out to you? What would you send them to?
You can download the app on the App Store. It's Juniver, and that's Juniver. For those interested in our premium offering, very happy to extend a code to your listeners. It's JuniPod, JuniPod, and that's a discount on the premium subscription, which gets you Junie, the personalized AI recovery coach, for a year. And then join juniver.com for the website with more information. We love to hear from you. If you have an eating disorder and want to take part in research helping advance it, you can sign up on junivertrial.com and access, if you meet the eligibility criteria, access the app for free for life. We really, encourage anyone who needs it to reach out and get the help they need. And my heart goes out to all of you, and I know that you can do this.
I hope that those listening who are affected with eating disorders, you just heard Emilie's heart in everything that she's said and what she's built and what she's created, and obviously she's been through as well. So I'll definitely encourage you to get involved. All the information around Juniver will be available in the show notes. So get involved, reach out, get involved, and change your life, because it does get better on the other side, as she has said. Thank you very much, Emilie, for coming on and just sharing. I can't believe that an hour's gone through already. There's so much in that. But really appreciate you coming onto the show. Absolutely loved it.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is Everyday Leadership. We will see you all next week.